Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Nocturnity. We have some absolutely ghastly late-night horror stories for you that are sure to have you covering your eyes with the blankets and holding them tight. As usual, we've saved the best for last, so be sure to listen right to the last second. As always, this broadcast is brought to you by cardanapparel.com. The link is in the description. Now, let's hesitate no longer and get right into these terrifying tales by entering the realm of eternal night. The term nightmare is an old one. It comes from a common occurrence in night terrors, where it feels like a massive weight is suddenly put on your torso while you're lying in bed. In the olden days, they equated this to a horse sitting on your chest. A horse, well, a female horse in particular, is also known as a mare, hence the term nightmare. I know this because I used to have night terrors, and my doctor told me what I just told you when I described my symptoms to him. More specifically, though, he diagnosed what I was experiencing as sleep paralysis. According to him, and science, this is all a figment of one's imagination. I beg to differ. I think what I experienced was not only very real, but done to me at the behest of outside entities. Like I kind of alluded to when I began, it all started as nightmares I would have where it felt like something was pressing down on my chest with great and consistent force. Only it wouldn't feel like I was dreaming. It's not like I was in different settings where this was happening all the time, as you'd expect of nightmares. Each time it happened, I would be laying in my bed about to go to sleep and then it would start up. In other words, it was as if it was happening when I was still awake, not after I'd fallen asleep. Sometimes it would feel like my feet were being held down to the mattress by invisible hands, and even other times it felt as if arms were coming up through the mattress, hugging around my body and trying to pull me down into it. I don't think I have to tell you how utterly terrifying this was. I mean, I could barely breathe. The feeling of suffocation was imminent the entire time, every time. And it was every night. I'd be fighting against this scenario with all my might, but unable to budge even an inch against the strength it was applying. By the time it was so much pressure that I'd think, I'm about to die, it would alleviate and disappear in an instant, and I'd sit up with the speed of a bullet screaming, "No!" Then I would sit there and pant and sweat, and I'd have to get out of my bed. I was in a living hell, and things only got worse. Pretty soon I wasn't just feeling things, I was seeing them too. The first was a shadowy figure that slowly moved along my bedroom wall. At the time, I had the feeling I was being squished into my bed like an ant under a boot, so I had no choice but to watch this slowly moving shadow make its way around my room while I suffered in agony. When I was finally released, the figure was gone, but it returned the next night. It all started the same way, me being pushed down against my mattress, but this time the shadowy figure, which I'd describe as a shadow of a man in a hood, made its way away from the wall and got closer to me, but disappeared at the peak of my fear when I was released from the tension. Again, I sat straight up and sucked all the air I could into my lungs. The third night, same routine. The shadow reappeared. This time it slowly made its way from the wall towards my bed, but I wasn't released. Soon it was hovering over me. Up close it was definitely a being in a black cloak. I couldn't see its face through the shadow its hood provided, but I heard it speak. Its voice was 100 times as horrifying as its image, which was enough to cripple me in fear to begin with, never mind the immense pressure on my chest holding me still. Its voice wasn't of this earth. It sounded like the voice of a demonic insect, low and grumbly with a kind of chirping to it. It was the most horrifying sound I'd ever heard. Someone must have got up to use the washroom at that moment, because light shone onto my bedroom floor through the crack at the bottom of the door. The figure quickly turned its head towards the door to watch, and then looked back at me before slinking back towards the wall, where he sort of shrank down and disappeared. After that, I was released from the pressure and sat up and screamed. My mother came running into the room and I explained what happened. That was when they finally decided to send me to a shrink. He surmised I had some issues with trauma and tried some counseling and gave me methods to try and center myself before bed each night, but none of it ever worked. This wasn't the result of any trauma. I lived a great life up to that point with minimum amount of things to stress me out. The only thing in my life that really ever gave me any stress was what was happening to me at night. In any case, While the pressure on my body never let up, the shadowy figure didn't return for weeks. When it finally did, it didn't show up alone. As I laid there feeling as if I was being crushed in a vice and struggling to breathe, my eyes nearly popping out of my head, it appeared along the wall and made its way to me in that slow, terrifying fashion, just as before. When it got close enough to be hovering over me, it stopped and assessed me before turning its head back towards where it had come from. What I saw then nearly killed me out of pure terror. It was another figure like the first, only larger. It gave off an air of importance. I automatically had the feeling that the one that arrived first, the one I'd been seeing in the past, answered to the one that had just appeared. I trembled under the pressure holding me to my mattress as it got closer and closer, and soon they were both hovering over me, one standing on each side of my bed and looking down at my face. Then the first one spoke again. That voice sent shivers down my spine. In fact, just remembering it at this moment does the same. Then the second spoke in response. Its voice was even lower and more horrifying than the first's, though the language, if you can call it that, was the same. After it spoke, it reached out its arm over my body, and I could see the long, spiny fingers of the creature coming forth out of its sleeve, though it too was nothing but a shadow. It reached up and put its palm above my face, and I could feel cold air radiating from it. Slowly it moved that hand down my body until it was over my stomach. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I was convinced this is how I was going to meet my demise. Suddenly the pressure on my chest disappeared and switched to a pressure on my back. I couldn't believe what was happening, but that pressure was raising my body in the air off my mattress, while the shadowy hand of the figure over my torso seemed to be guiding me upwards. Still, though, I couldn't move my arms or legs. I was now high above my mattress, face to face with this monster, my stomach freezing from the chill ruminating from its shadowy hand. Like the other time, someone woke up to use the washroom and light from the hall outside my room made its way under the door. Both of the shadowy figures jerked their heads towards it, then looked at each other. An instant later, the one with the hand over my stomach pushed down like he was trying to squish a bug, and I went full speed back down to my mattress, hitting it so hard the legs on my bed snapped all at once. The wind was completely blown out of my lungs upon impact, and as I struggled for breath, and as pain shot through my body, the shadows made their way back to the wall and disappeared just in time for my dad to open my door and come running in to see what happened. He was at a loss for words when we inspected the bed. Not only were the legs of the bed broken, but the springs in the mattress were totaled. He agreed that there was no chance of me being able to inflict such damage in that fashion, and had no choice but to give credence to my story. Besides, he knew me better than anyone, and knew I wouldn't lie about such a thing. My mother took a little more convincing. It's not that she thought I was being dishonest. I think the story scared her so bad that her mind wouldn't let her accept the evidence for what it was. She said it was just another nightmare, and I had clearly gotten violent in my sleep. The shrink said the same thing, but both of them knew, just like me and my father knew, that there is no possible way I could have done that to my bed. Even if I had jumped from the roof onto my mattress, landing on my back as I had, I couldn't have broken those springs like that. Regardless of what anyone said, I was allowed to sleep in the living room until my father found us a new house to live in, and there was no pushback from my mother on the subject, which kind of proved to me that deep down, she knew what was up, even if she couldn't admit it to herself. Eventually we did move, and I never had another night terror, or nightmare, or encounter of any kind in my new room. Better yet, I didn't have to see a shrink again. But I promise you this, I'll never forget those nights for as long as I live. Whatever those things were, they'll live rent-free in my mind forever, no matter how hard I try to evict them. "22 years ago to this day, I was awoken in my sleep. At first I didn't know why. In that freshly awakened state, I didn't know much of anything. But I soon clued into what was happening when I heard sounds coming from downstairs in my house. I lived alone, so no thought was given to it being someone else I lived with getting a midnight snack from the kitchen or something of that sort, nor did I have any pets. No, this was an uninvited guest, or guests, and they were up to something down there. I laid still and focused in on exactly what I was hearing. My bedroom was at the top of the stairs from the living room, and this is definitely where the noises were coming from. They weren't loud, but they were audible. Whoever it was trying to be quiet about it. My first thought was, I'm being robbed. Someone's broken into the house and they're stealing all my things. This was a horrendously scary thought. I'm not a big guy, and I own no weapons, so if they decided to enter my room, it wouldn't be good for me at all, and confronting them was out of the question, so I just laid there perfectly still. It sounded to me like the cable hooked up to the back of the television was being unscrewed. For those too young to remember, this is how Cablevision used to work. No box or HDMI cords. You literally had a wire coming out of the wall that you'd screw into a knob on the back of your big box of a television set. And the sound of it being unscrewed was unique and familiar. In my terrified state, I decided I had to find the nerve to do something before this intruder opened my bedroom door. So I picked up the phone beside my bed to dial 911, and as soon as I did, the noises downstairs ceased. But this only worked to increase my already extreme state of panic because the phone had no dial tone. Instead, I heard breathing. That is to say, someone in my house had another phone already picked up to their ear. I was paralyzed with fear at that moment. The only thing that got me moving was the blaring tones that began to shriek in my ear. Those tones, once again for my younger audience, occurred when your phone had been off the hook for a long amount of time, and they were extra loud because they had to notify you when the phone wasn't to your ear. So you can imagine how loud they were with the receiver pressed tight against mine at that moment. I recoiled and threw the phone to the ground. Then the movement downstairs really picked up. They knew I knew about them, and my only thought was, they're going to be coming for me now. Out of instinct, I jumped out of the bed and turned the little turn lock on my door handle, then sat with my back against the door to barricade it as best I could. In the few seconds that I did this, I could hear stomping up my stairs, 2 sets. So now I knew there were 2 men outside my door. One of them wasted no time in trying the handle. Finding it was locked, they began to kick the door. Suddenly they began attacking the handle. It was broken off within a couple attempts to do so. This was it, I thought. They're gonna kill me. I was shaking uncontrollably while at the same time digging my heels into my carpet and pushing with all my strength against that thin wooden bedroom door of mine. Suddenly a thought occurred to me, and I grabbed the phone cord and dragged the entire phone off my nightstand to where I was situated and picked it up and threw it across the room at my bedroom window, smashing it to pieces with a loud burst. I then gave the most powerful scream I'd ever given in my life, yelling help again and again. The noises at my door stopped almost immediately, and I heard whoever that was run downstairs, fumble with the front door for a second, and then whip it open. I sat there panting for a few minutes, paying close attention to what sounds I heard downstairs. There were none. I assumed the coast was clear, but still didn't have the nerve to go check. Instead, I jumped to my feet and went to my broken window and hopped out onto the awning just below it, and then hopped into my neighbor's backyard and began pounding on their back door. They woke up and came to the door in a huff. The cops were called and they arrived within 5 or 10 minutes. At that point, I went back home. My things were all over the living room, but nothing was missing. The burglars had pried my garage window open to get into the house. After a string of robberies in the area, 2 drug addicts were caught a few months later, and the police figured they were the same 2 that were in my place, because at each house they robbed, a phone was taken off the hook to stifle the residents from calling the cops if they woke up. One would gather the goods while the other listened to the phone receiver. That way he could hang up when the off-the-hook tone started and then pick the phone back up to tie up the line again. That night caused me trauma like I'd never experienced. I found it hard to sleep for months after that, and could only do so very lightly with a gun on my nightstand. Every little sound would jar me awake. I figured that was no way to live and took the plunge to see a psychologist. Thankfully, it helped. I used to work in a photo shop in Wyoming, back when you had to bring film into a shop to get your pictures developed. We were only open until 8 p.m., but the shop stayed functioning 24 hours a day. I worked the night shift. My job was to take rolls of film and develop them in the darkroom. For those who don't know, this was a room lit by dim red lights that you blew up pictures in tubs of chemical solution, to put it shortly. It was a creepy room at any time, but I worked in the middle of the night, when the place was silent, which made it all the creepier. I'd try to be in and out of there as quick as possible, but most of my shifts revolved around being in that dark room most of the time. One night I brought in a roll and went to work on it, and came out to find that the jacket that I always hung on the back of my chair behind the front counter was now on the floor. But what jarred me about it was where it was on the floor. If it had fallen off the chair, it would have been under the chair, right? Well, it wasn't anywhere near it. It was about 9 or 10 feet away, where the counter opened up to get from behind it to the front of the store to the area where the customers were. I remember stopping dead in my tracks when I stepped outside of the darkroom and saw it there. I instinctively scanned the shop and saw nothing else out of the ordinary. Despite that, my fear was readily in effect. I was sure I hung my jacket on the chair that night like I did every other night. But, I told myself, I must have thrown it on the counter tonight, and I went over to pick it up. And as I bent down, I heard the darkroom door close behind me. It didn't slam, it just clicked closed quietly, but I still shot around in surprise. It had never closed on its own before. Now I was genuinely freaked out. But I walked over cautiously to the door anyways and opened it up. Inside was the dark red room, half the size of the entire shop, with 2 tables running the length of it, holding tubs and pictures hanging from lines above them. The red light seemed to be buzzing louder than usual, but I think that's because in my high alert state, my senses were heightened. I knew something was off, I could just feel it. So I hesitated to step inside and just said for some reason, "I know you're in here." To my horror, a man appeared from behind a table at the back of the room and slowly stood up. We looked at each other in silence for a sec, then he made his move, lunging at me at full speed. I acted quick and slammed the door and turned the lock on it before he got there. I stepped back in shock as he pounded on the door and luckily had the sense to pick up the phone and call the cops. I'm so lucky that was a heavy door with a good lock on it. He kicked it as hard as a battering ram again and again and again, and it wouldn't budge. Finally, he gave up, and I could hear him going apeshit in the room until the police arrived. I was told to step outside, and they arrested the guy after a battle. Then they took him outside and walked him right past me to the squad car. His face is seared into my mind forever. He looked like a lunatic. He was huge, with his head shaved bald and the eyes of a soulless monster. They found out he was armed with a very large knife. I don't know what his plan was that night, but it couldn't have been good. It turns out he'd been in and out of psychiatric hospitals for most of his life, and that's where he was put after his trial. I quit the photo shop and never worked another graveyard shift anywhere after that night. Man, that was close. I spent the first 30-plus years of my life in Camden Town, which is arguably the most urban borough of London. That is to say, I'm a child of the city through and through. However, my ancestors are from Scotland, and while I wouldn't trade my upbringing for the world, by my late 20s, I began to feel a longing for the life of those who came before me. I'd catch myself time to time daydreaming of a simpler life on a Scottish farm, raising sheep, riding horses, tending to vegetation and all that. And as luck would have it, I was fortunate enough by my mid-30s to have made a good enough living to turn that dream into a reality. The decision came after the worst breakup of my life. I was set to marry in June of that year, 2014, but was single by March. It just didn't work out how either of us had hoped. I'll spare you the details and leave it at that episode being the nudge it took to leave London and take a shot at a new life. I quickly found farmland in Dumfriesshire, the exact area my family on my mother's side came to England from. It was massive. It felt like I had bought more land than all of Camden was composed of, and it was all mine. The 3-bedroom farmhouse was built in the early 17th century out of sandstone and sat beside a few outbuildings, including stables and a great big livestock shed that altogether formed a fantastic courtyard between them all. It was a bit of a fixer-upper, but I was up for the challenge. I figured by the summer I would be ready to begin purchasing animals and learning how to manage the place, step by step, and quite excited for the challenge. That all changed rather quickly, I regret to report. Within the first week of my stay, I awoke in the night dreadfully parched and went to the kitchen to fetch a glass of water. As I stood by the sink in the dark of the night, filling my glass, something outside the window caught my eye and startled me half to death. In the distance, back by the mulberry bushes about a half an acre from my back door, was what appeared to be a man standing perfectly still staring back at me. I dropped the glass in the sink upon first sight and it shattered to pieces, which made me jump all the more. Looking back up, the man appeared to still be there. Of course, it was dark, and only the moon behind some light clouds was providing any form of light, so it wasn't perfectly clear what was there. It couldn't be, I said to myself as I squinted to get a better look. He certainly wasn't moving, if it was a he. I tried to convince myself that it must be a shadow of some sort playing tricks on my eyes, but the more I stared, the more my eyes adjusted to the light, or rather, the lack of light, and the clearer it became that this was a definite person standing there, and they were making no qualms about being seen either. This man stood in place and looked right back at me through the nighttime mist, knowing I was doing the same from the window. A chill went down my back as we played this game of who will blink first. I was rightly terrified this bloke was going to charge the farmhouse and slaughter me like a pig, and so I didn't take my eyes off of him. That is, until I did. But only for a second or two to finally reach for the faucet when I realized it had now been running the whole time, and when I looked back up, he was gone. That was equally as terrifying. At least when I could see him, I knew he wasn't hiding somewhere nearby and planning on pouncing. But night turned into day, and the man was nowhere to be seen. Tired, but still alert from the experience, I worked up the nerve to go outside as the morning was underway. I opened the door slowly and scanned the area all around before stepping outside. It was clear. Soon I was all the way at the other end of the yard, right where I had seen the strange visitor, and there was no one to be seen for acres in all directions. Next, I checked all the other buildings around the property, which, let me tell you, was a terrifying journey in itself. I was still unfamiliar with all these abandoned buildings, and being inside of them with nowhere to run, especially the livestock shed where countless thousands of animals had been gutted over the decades, had my heart palpitating. In the end, there was no traces of anybody. By that afternoon, in the calm of the day, and it was a beautifully bright one at that, I convinced myself that the man I saw was just a figment of my imagination. I was in new, unfamiliar surroundings, and I thought to myself, like a child, I've turned shadows into monsters. I laughed at myself and went about my day, not giving a second thought to it. Until, that is, the sun began to set. Then I got a little unnerved. Enough so that I checked the kitchen window before going off to bed. But of course I saw nothing worth stressing over and fell asleep without issue. That night, however, I once again woke up with a terrible thirst, and once again meandered down to the kitchen to fix myself a glass of water. Half asleep, but more attentive and expectant than the night before, I first glanced at the microwave to see that it was 1:01 in the morning, and then I peeked outside the window as I turned the faucet on. And there he was, in the same place he'd been as the night before, unmistakable at first glance this time. Thankfully, I'd looked outside before I'd grabbed a glass this night and didn't end up dropping another. But avoiding that calamity wasn't the case for my heart. The fright nearly toppled me over once again. The man stood there, arms a little out at his sides, and all his fingers visibly clenched. He stood somewhat hunched over, and though I couldn't make out his eyes or facial features at all from that distance, it was once again obvious that he was looking directly at me. In fact, it felt as though he was staring daggers right into me. I did my best to remain calm, but in my state of panic I could feel my entire body quavering. Who the hell was this man? Why the hell was he on my property? Where the hell did he come from? And most importantly, what the hell did he want? He was unflinching, making the situation all the more tense. I just waited for him to start his charge towards me, at which point I didn't know what I'd do. But he didn't move, and aside from the nerve-driven shaking, neither did I. We once again stared at each other. Looking away for literally half a second to once again turn off the water made the man disappear for a second night in a row. Again I felt the fear of ignorance as to where he went, and worse, where he now may turn up. But as time passed, he made no return. I had half a mind to call the local bobbies just before his disappearance that night, but thought twice about it after he'd disappeared. For one, the police out there would have taken forever to arrive. For another, what would I tell them? I saw a man and now he's gone? Meanwhile, that was 2 nights with next to no sleep. I was fed up with this, and so after I checked the outbuildings and acreage once again under the safety of sunlight, I traveled into town to take what I felt was a very necessary step. I pulled into the sporting goods shop and purchased a rifle. Well, to be specific for those interested, a Landber Elite shotgun, the first and only firearm I've ever touched. After an hour or so with a Roser who certified me, it was legally mine. I left town fully armed and dangerous, and I must admit, though I hate guns, much more confident. I almost hoped the man would be back. However, that excitement and silly bravado wore off quite quickly. Even before sundown that day, I was back to being level-headed enough to know I wouldn't want to shoot a man, even if I was in danger. I would if I had to, though, but I prayed it wouldn't come to that. That night, even though I was exhausted, I decided to stay up and keep my eye in the backyard. I sat in the kitchen with my gun on the table for hours, continuously checking on the spot that he'd been both nights previous, and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of him. In time, I found myself nodding off in my chair, and decided I was through playing stakeout. It was time for bed. The night was just past 1 a.m., and I was ready for a long, deep sleep. But no sooner than I'd hit the light switch did I see him. Same spot, same position. My tiredness evaporated in an instant and my heartbeat picked up. For a third time, I stood locked in place, watching him watch me. Okay, I told myself, this is it. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the shotgun from the table and marched towards the back door. Then bursting it open, I took aim and shouted, "Don't move or I'll..." He was gone. It was impossible. I'd seen him a second prior. I darted my head in every direction. There was nothing. Nobody. Only darkness and rolling mist. Where the hell did he go? I got so tense with panic I nearly pulled the trigger by accident, but luckily didn't. With no sign of the uninvited trespasser, and the pressure of the moment only mounting, I slammed the door and latched it. I then stood and caught my breath. When my anxiousness came to a manageable level, I went back to the table to put the gun down, but clenched it tight before doing so as out of the corner of my eye I saw him again. I ran to the kitchen window to confirm. Yes, sir, it was him. He was in the exact same spot, as if he'd never moved an inch. I ran back to the door and opened it wide, again pointing the shotgun in his direction, but he was gone. I've lost my marbles, I said to myself in a state of shock. That was a horrible feeling. The fear hadn't left me at all. However, now piled on top of it was the uneasiness of feeling as if I was cracking up. In that wild mind state, I suddenly found myself marching towards the mulberry bushes, my weapon pointed out in front of me like a flashlight. I made it to where he stood moments before in no time, yet there was no one to be seen. No footprints in the dewy grass, save my own. Nothing to imply a bloke had been there at all. I let my arms fall as I stood there in the cold of the night, confusion gripping my whole existence. I shook my head as if to gain back my sanity before suddenly tensing up every muscle in my body. There the bastard was, staring daggers at me from my own kitchen window. Without much thought at all, I pointed and blasted off 2 shots at the house and then ran at it in full stride. I ran into the kitchen and turned every which way to finish the bastard off. But, as you'd guess, he wasn't anywhere to be found. I ran all over the house screaming for him to show himself, that I'd kill him when I found him. But I never did. After a few searches of the whole house, I was panting and ended up collapsing on the kitchen floor, overwhelmed from the frenzy I'd been worked into. I woke up with the sun beaming in the open back door a few meters to my right. Another beautiful spring morning in Scotland, but I wouldn't know it. I was utterly disoriented. It took a moment to regroup where I was and what had happened. I stood up and looked around. There was glass all over the floor. Walking out the back door, I had a look at the house. For a first-time shooter, I wasn't half bad. I'd hit my target. The kitchen window and the walls on both sides of it were riddled with holes from the scattered pellets that had exploded out of the shotgun shells I'd fired. I scratched my head and regrouped a little more as memories of the night before spun around my mind, and then went back inside. I grabbed a broom and started to sweep up the mess I'd made, but stopped abruptly as I glanced out the window. No, the man wasn't there, but something else was. I dropped the broom and power walked out the door towards the mulberry bushes. Getting there, I confirmed what I thought I'd saw. There, in the place where the trespasser had stood, was my shotgun standing perfectly vertical, its barrel stuck into the peat as Excalibur had been driven into the stone. That was the figurative last straw for me. I pulled it out of the ground and looked around in defeat. "You win!" I shouted to the wind. "You win!" That was my last day as a farmer. I packed up my things and headed back to London, selling the farm not long after, and never returned. Well, we've reached the end of the broadcast for tonight, my friends. I hope you've enjoyed your trip into the zone of Nocturnity. Please come back soon as we have a plethora of strange and terrifying audio stories and quality video documentaries on the way for you. Help our young channel grow and survive by sharing and, at the very least, liking this video before you leave tonight. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now. You will not regret it. This broadcast has, as always, been brought to you by cardanapparel.com. CARDAN apparel.com will not only have you looking great and have your friends asking where you got your threads, but to shop with them is to support this channel in the process. The link is in the description. And remember, if you haven't had your fix yet, our channel's video section is full of other stories just dying for you to hear them. Go now and keep that vibe resonating. In the meantime, a new broadcast is already in the works. Until then, my friends, stay safe.